The power in silence. In the heart of the city, beneath a clear blue sky that stretched endlessly, stood Grant National Bank, an institution that had stood as a cornerstone of financial success for decades. Its structure was as grand as its reputation. Gleaming white marble columns framed the entrance, their grandeur designed to inspire awe and reverence. Inside, high ceilings bore the ornate carvings of eagles, a silent proclamation of power and prestige. The bank was a symbol of unyielding tradition, where change seemed unnecessary, almost unwelcome. Robert Callahan, the bank's manager, believed himself to be its guardian. A man in his late 40s, with sharp features and neatly combed salt and pepper hair, Robert moved with the certainty of someone who belonged. His tailored suit fit like a second skin, and his polished leather shoes clicked with purpose as he strode through the lobby. To the staff, his presence was an unspoken command. Composure, control, and precision were non-negotiable. That morning, Robert began his day the same way he always did, scanning his neatly organized desk for the schedule. A few high-net-worth clients would be stopping by later. Familiar names, the right kind of clients, he mused. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," greeted Eliza, a junior cashier who had been with the bank for a little over a year. Bright-eyed and eager, she often looked for ways to prove herself, though her enthusiasm sometimes grated on Robert's nerves. To him, junior employees had one job: follow orders and keep quiet. "Morning, Eliza," Robert replied, his tone clipped, eyes already fixed on the reports in his hand. He barely registered her cheery smile before she turned back to her counter. The lobby was its usual hum of quiet activity. Clients walked purposefully to their designated appointments, dressed in the polished veneer of success. The sound of heels on marble and the faint ding of the vaults were the backdrop to the unshakable rhythm of wealth. And then she walked in. Victoria Brooks. The soft creak of the glass doors swinging open broke the atmosphere, though only momentarily. Victoria stepped into the bank, her presence commanding attention without asking for it. She was the kind of woman who didn't have to raise her voice or adopt an air of superiority. Her calm, poised demeanor spoke louder than words ever could. Victoria wore a tailored black pantsuit, the fine fabric hugging her frame in a way that whispered quiet wealth. Her skin glowed with the confidence of someone who had spent years earning her place in rooms that were never built for her. Her short bob framed her face with sharp elegance, and the briefcase in her hand, a polished leather statement piece, looked as though it had stories to tell. As she crossed the threshold, Victoria's heels echoed louder than anyone else's in the room. It wasn't just her appearance that drew the stares. It was the question that followed her. Who is she? Behind the counter, Eliza froze. There was something magnetic about the woman who had just entered, and instinctively, Eliza straightened her back. She watched as Victoria strode toward the counter, stopping before her station. "Good morning," Victoria said, her voice smooth and clear. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Eliza replied, willing herself not to fumble her words. Victoria pulled a check from her briefcase. Its edges were crisp, its ink fresh. "I'd like to deposit this into my corporate account." Eliza accepted the check, her eyes widening at the figure printed on it. She blinked twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, an amount most people would associate with multiple lifetimes of work. Regaining her composure, she offered a polite smile. "One moment, ma'am. I'll need to direct you to our manager for verification." Victoria gave a small nod, unfazed. She had been here before, though not in this particular building. The script was all too familiar. Eliza signaled to an assistant, and within moments, Victoria was being escorted across the marble floor toward the manager's office. Robert Callahan was still flipping through reports when the assistant knocked on his door. "Sir, a client with a sizable deposit is here to see you." Robert glanced up from his work. "Send them in." When Victoria entered, Robert's eyes briefly flicked upward, but he didn't look at her long enough to truly see her. His first impression wasn't of her confidence or her success. It was of her difference. Victoria's calm presence unsettled him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "Good morning," she said, her voice even. Robert gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Without a word, Victoria placed the check on the desk, sliding it toward him with practiced ease. Robert picked it up, his eyes scanning the figure as his brow furrowed slightly. It was instinct now, an unconscious doubt, one he had repeated over years of similar moments with similar clients. He looked up at Victoria, his expression guarded. "This is quite a sum," he said slowly. "May I ask the source of these funds?" Victoria's expression didn't waver. She held her head high, her voice smooth as silk. "All the necessary information is on the check. My corporate details are listed, and you can verify them with my legal team if needed." Her tone was measured, professional, but there was an undercurrent of steel. Robert leaned back in his chair, fingers steepling. "Even so, for checks of this amount, we have strict protocols in place. I'll need to perform additional verification." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him. The tension in the room grew thicker. "And what, exactly, is prompting this need for additional verification?" she asked. Robert hesitated. He was still holding the check as though it might explode. "I'm simply doing my job, ma'am. Large deposits require extra scrutiny." Victoria's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. Not one of amusement, but one of quiet recognition. "Here it comes," she thought. "Of course," she replied. "However, I find it curious that despite all of my documentation being in order, you're still insisting on additional steps. Are you suggesting there's an issue with my funds?" "I'm suggesting," Robert said slowly, "that transactions of this nature are uncommon." He faltered, but the damage had been done. His hesitation wasn't procedural, it was personal, and Victoria knew it. She leaned forward slightly, her hand still resting elegantly on her briefcase. "Uncommon for whom, Mr. Callanan?" Robert stiffened, his face suddenly coloring. "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm simply following protocol." Victoria held his gaze, her silence a weapon. She didn't need to argue or raise her voice. The truth was already written in the space between them. Robert felt it, too. His shoulders tightened as though the weight of the room was pressing down on him. A soft knock at the door broke the moment. "Excuse me," said Eliza timidly as she entered, glancing at Victoria before turning to Robert. "Sir, I know this client. Her account is in excellent standing, and we've processed similar transactions for her before." Robert's jaw tightened. "Eliza, this isn't your concern. Please return to your post." Eliza hesitated, her cheeks coloring. She cast an apologetic glance toward Victoria before turning and slipping out of the room. Victoria watched the exchange quietly, but when Eliza was gone, she stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate. "If you're unable to process my transaction," Victoria said, her voice cool but firm, "then I'll contact someone with the authority to override you." Robert's face turned red. "Ma'am, I can assure you." Victoria raised a hand, cutting him off. "No need. I'll make the call." She reached into her briefcase, pulled out her phone, and began scrolling through her contacts. Her actions were unhurried, and the message was clear. She wasn't going to argue with someone who didn't recognize her worth. Robert sat frozen, watching her. In that moment, the air seemed to shift. The manager who had started his morning with quiet confidence now felt as though he were losing control. And the woman sitting across from him, calm, composed, powerful, was teaching him a lesson he wasn't prepared to learn. Victoria lifted the phone to her ear, her posture unshaken. "Good morning, Jean," she said into the receiver. "It's Victoria Brooks. I'm at the Grant National Branch downtown, and I seem to be running into a bit of a problem." Robert's heart sank. The calm before the storm. Victoria Brooks remained seated in the worn leather chair of Robert Callahan's office, her phone still pressed to her ear as the call connected. The silence in the room, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning, felt heavy, almost oppressive. Across the desk, Robert tried to maintain a mask of authority, though beads of sweat had begun to collect at the edge of his neatly combed hairline. "Yes, Jen, I'll hold," Victoria said calmly. She glanced up at Robert, the faintest flicker of amusement in her gaze, a gaze that didn't miss the tension in his shoulders or the tight line of his mouth. Robert couldn't take his eyes off her. Who was this woman? The name Victoria Brooks rattled around in his mind, yet it meant nothing to him. His discomfort grew with every second she stayed on the phone, her calm demeanor only amplifying his unease. Why was she calling the regional director directly? He wondered. Victoria's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jen, thank you for taking my call. I'm sitting in your downtown branch, dealing with what I can only call a surprising situation." She paused, her tone deliberate. "Yes, I'm speaking with Robert Callahan now." There was no yelling or finger-pointing. No raised voices. Victoria didn't need theatrics to hold power. Her composure spoke volumes. On the other end of the line, Jen Ellis, the regional director, responded sharply enough that even Robert could hear the muffled tone. Victoria nodded occasionally, listening intently, then offered a brief response. "I understand. Yes, I'll wait here. I trust you'll handle this appropriately." She ended the call and carefully set her phone back into her briefcase. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat. "Ms. Brooks, I assure you I was merely following." Victoria raised her hand, silencing him without effort. "You've said enough, Mr. Callahan." Her words landed like a heavy blow, though her tone remained as smooth as ever. Before Robert could muster another weak defense, there was a sharp knock at the office door. It opened to reveal Jane Ellis herself, impeccably dressed in a slate-gray suit and matching heels, her expression a mask of cool authority. Jane was a woman who commanded attention the moment she entered any room, and today was no exception. "Victoria," Jane greeted warmly, extending her hand as she crossed the office. "My apologies for the inconvenience. I got here as quickly as I could." Victoria rose gracefully, shaking Jen's hand. "Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it." Robert's face paled visibly at the exchange. He hadn't expected Jean to arrive in person, not for something as trivial as a transaction. And yet here she was. Jean turned toward him, her gaze sharp enough to slice through glass. "Robert, what exactly is the issue here?" Robert fumbled for words. "Ms. Ellis, I was verifying a check of considerable value. I was following protocol, as required." Jean didn't let him finish. "The check you're referring to, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice dangerously even, "comes from one of the most significant corporate accounts in this entire bank. A corporate account that, if you had taken one moment to verify properly, would have shown you its owner. Victoria Brooks, our largest shareholder." The words hit Robert like a train. His jaw slackened slightly, and he blinked as if trying to process what he just heard. "Shareholder," he muttered, almost to himself. "Yes," Jean snapped. "Ms. Brooks isn't just a client. She owns a controlling stake in this bank. The funds you so carefully questioned," she said with disdain, "are part of her own business operations." Robert's throat went dry. I didn't know." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Jean shot back. "You didn't know. You didn't take the time to look, to think, to see." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's confidence, the self-assurance he wore like armor, had crumbled entirely. His authority, once so unquestionable, now felt hollow and exposed. Victoria observed him quietly. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked mildly disappointed, like a teacher who'd just watched her most arrogant student fail the simplest test. Jean stepped aside, gesturing toward Victoria. "Ms. Brooks, allow me to personally escort you to the lounge. I'll ensure your transaction is handled immediately." "Thank you, Jen," Victoria said softly, gathering her belongings. She turned back toward Robert, her gaze steady. "Good luck, Mr. Callahan." Those words lingered in the air long after she'd walked out, leaving Robert alone in his office, his career hanging by a thread. The fallout begins. Victoria followed Jean out of the office, passing the glass-walled cubicles of employees who now stared openly as the two women walked by. Whispers buzzed quietly like static. "She's a shareholder. Did you see the manager's face? I heard she's worth millions." Eliza stood near the cashier counter, her hands gripping the edge of the desk nervously. When Victoria's eyes met hers, Eliza flinched, but Victoria offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Ms. Brooks," Eliza said softly, as if unsure whether to speak, "I'm sorry for the way that went." Victoria paused, studying her for a moment. "Don't apologize for his mistake." Eliza's cheeks flushed red. "Still, I didn't want to make things worse." "You didn't," Victoria said gently. She glanced at Jen. "This young woman spoke up when it mattered. I hope that's noticed." Jean nodded knowingly, her expression softening. "It will be, I assure you." The two women continued to the executive lounge, where Victoria's transaction was processed within minutes. Jean made sure everything was handled with the utmost care, personally signing off on every form. Robert's reckoning. Back in his office, Robert sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the walls. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The name Victoria Brooks now echoed like a curse. He hadn't seen her, not for who she was, not for what she represented. Robert prided himself on his experience, his ability to read clients, yet today he'd been blind. His assumptions, so small and insidious, had betrayed him. A knock at his door broke the silence. Jean stepped in, her expression unreadable. "Robert," she said calmly, "we need to talk." The conversation was short, direct, and unforgiving. Jean outlined the consequences of his actions: a formal investigation into his conduct, a temporary leave of absence, and the clear understanding that his future at the bank was in jeopardy. "You embarrassed this institution today," Jean said finally, "and you nearly cost us the trust of one of our most important shareholders. I can't overlook that." Robert nodded mutely. He didn't argue. What could he say? Every word Jean spoke was true. As she left, the door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone once more, this time with the realization that his career, built over decades, might now be reduced to nothing. Victoria's message. That evening, Victoria returned to her office on the top floor of a sleek downtown skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave her a breathtaking view of the city she'd worked so hard to help build. She poured herself a glass of water, reflecting quietly on the day's events. Her assistant entered, holding a small folder. "Ms. Brooks, the summary from today's meeting is ready." "Thank you, Angela," Victoria replied. Angela hesitated. "If I may, are you okay?" Victoria looked up, her expression thoughtful. "I'm fine. But I'll tell you this. Change takes patience, persistence, and courage. Today was a reminder that we still have a long way to go." Angela nodded, inspired by the quiet determination in her boss's voice. Victoria leaned back in her chair, gazing at the city lights. Today wasn't about one man's ignorance. It was about a system, one she was determined to help change. Tomorrow, she would send a message to the entire institution. Bias has no place in the future of this bank, and she wasn't asking for permission to make that change. The echoes of change. The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Robert Callahan arrived at the bank the following morning. He'd spent a sleepless night pacing his living room, replaying every moment of the previous day in excruciating detail. The check, Victoria's piercing stare, Jane's scathing words. His career, his reputation, and the authority he had prided himself on felt as fragile as glass now, and he was afraid that at any moment it would shatter completely. Robert stood in the doorway of his office, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. Just beyond the glass walls of his private workspace, the staff bustled about, but something was different. Conversations were hushed. Glances darted toward him and then quickly away. He could feel it. The whispers, the silent judgment that rippled through the branch like a current he couldn't escape. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped inside, his movements slower than usual, lacking the confidence they once carried. On his desk, a small folded note sat atop the pile of untouched paperwork. It was addressed to him, written in an elegant looping script. Mr. Callahan, your presence is required at the regional office at 2:00 p.m. sharp. Jen Ellis. Robert sank into his chair, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over him like a heavy cloak. A formal meeting. His hands tightened into fists. He knew this wouldn't be just another stern talking to. His days of unquestioned authority were officially numbered. Victoria's vision. Across town, in the sleek corner office of Brooks Enterprises, Victoria Brooks stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the bustling streets below. She held a steaming cup of coffee, though she had yet to take a sip. Her assistant, Angela, stood patiently beside her, holding a stack of documents. "Any word from Jean yet?" Victoria asked finally, breaking the silence. "She emailed this morning. The internal review of the downtown branch begins today. She said she's already spoken to several key managers." Victoria nodded slowly, a quiet determination in her posture. "Good. And the Cultural Training Initiative?" Angela handed her a sheet of paper. "We've compiled a proposal for a mandatory training program on workplace bias and equity. I also contacted a consultant to help us design something comprehensive." Victoria scanned the document, her lips pressing into a firm line. "Make sure it's thorough. This isn't just about appearances. The real work begins now." Angela hesitated. "And Mr. Callahan?" Victoria turned from the window, her gaze sharp. "What about him? He's under review, but do you think he deserves a second chance?" Victoria considered the question carefully. A second chance isn't about what he deserves. It's about whether he's willing to change. If Robert Callahan can face his own shortcomings and do better, then perhaps he has a place in the future of this bank. If not, she didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Robert's fate lay in his hands now. Schedule a meeting with Jean and the other stakeholders for tomorrow. Victoria continued, setting the paper aside. "We're going to establish new policies, and I want the staff to know what's coming. This isn't just about damage control, it's about setting a new standard." Angela nodded and left the office, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts. The staff meeting. Back at the downtown branch, Robert's nerves tightened with every passing hour. At 10:00 a.m., Jen Ellis arrived, her sharp heels clicking against the marble as she called for an all-staff meeting in the conference room. Staff members hurried in, exchanging nervous glances, sensing that today wasn't business as usual. When the room was full, Jean stood at the front of the conference table, her expression as unyielding as stone. "I won't waste anyone's time," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Yesterday's events were unacceptable. A valued client, our largest shareholder, Victoria Brooks, was subjected to unnecessary scrutiny and disrespect. That cannot happen again." The room fell silent, and all eyes darted to Robert, who sat near the back of the room, staring down at his hands. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the resentment. It was suffocating. Jean continued, "This incident has exposed deeper issues within this branch. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place here. Effective immediately, we'll be implementing changes. These include mandatory training for all staff, stricter review processes for transactions, and an open-door complaints policy for clients and employees alike." Murmurs broke out among the employees, though no one dared voice their concerns too loudly. Eliza, seated near the front, straightened her back and glanced nervously at Robert. Jean held up a hand, silencing the room once again. "For anyone who feels this doesn't apply to them, let me be clear, it applies to everyone. This isn't about blaming one person. It's about addressing a culture that allowed yesterday to happen. Her gaze lingered on Robert for a fraction of a second before she moved on. The regional office will oversee this transition, but we're all responsible for ensuring it succeeds. Any questions? The room remained silent, though tension hung heavy in the air. Finally, Jean nodded. Very well. Let's get to work. As the meeting ended, staff members filed out quietly. Robert remained seated, his body heavy with shame and uncertainty. Eliza hesitated near the door, glancing back at him, before turning and leaving with the others. The private meeting. At 2:00 p.m., Robert arrived at the regional office as instructed. The building's sleek glass facade reflected the sunlight, but to Robert, it felt cold and unwelcoming. He was escorted to a large conference room where Jean Ellis sat waiting, flanked by 2 HR representatives. "Sit down, Robert," Jean said simply, gesturing to a chair. Robert did as instructed, feeling like a man on trial. "Let's not drag this out," Jean began. "We're conducting a formal review of your behavior and performance, and I'd like to hear your side of things." Robert swallowed hard, his voice tight as he spoke. "Jen, I didn't mean any disrespect yesterday. I was just following procedure." The check was. "Stop," Jean interrupted, holding up a hand. "Do you really believe you treated Ms. Brooks like any other client?" Robert hesitated, shame coloring his face. "No," he admitted quietly. "I didn't." Jean leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Why?" The question cut deeper than Robert expected. For the first time, he felt truly exposed. Why had he reacted that way? Why had he doubted her? His mind searched for an answer, but all he found was an uncomfortable truth. Because I made assumptions," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "About who she was. What she looked like." Jean nodded slowly, as though waiting for him to face the truth himself. "Bias isn't always obvious, Robert, but it's insidious. Yesterday, it nearly cost us a major relationship and tarnished the reputation of this institution." "I understand," Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry." "Apologies are a start," Jean replied. "But actions matter more. You'll be required to complete the new cultural awareness training, and we'll be monitoring your performance closely." Robert looked up, surprised. "I'm not being fired." Jean's expression softened slightly. "Not yet. You've been given an opportunity to change, Robert. Don't waste it." Robert nodded, gratitude and shame swirling in equal measure. "Thank you. I won't." The ripple effect. The next morning, Victoria Brooks received an email from Jean Ellis detailing the outcome of Robert Callahan's review. He would remain in his position, for now, but under strict oversight and with mandatory training. Victoria read the email carefully, her expression thoughtful. She didn't rejoice in Robert's punishment. She didn't need to. The real victory, she knew, was in the changes now underway. At the bank, the staff began their training sessions. Eliza watched the presentations on unconscious bias with interest, feeling a renewed sense of hope that things could truly improve. She thought of Victoria Brooks, her calm authority, her refusal to be silenced, and felt inspired. A week later, a small envelope arrived on Eliza's desk. Inside was a handwritten note. "Eliza, your courage didn't go unnoticed. If you're ever looking for a new opportunity, contact me. Victoria Brooks." Eliza smiled, clutching the note to her chest. A shift in the foundation. The air at Grant National Bank felt different. Change is rarely quiet, and the tremors of Victoria Brooks' visit were still rippling through its walls. From the marble entrance to the back offices, whispers of the incident buzzed like static electricity, spoken in corners, over coffee machines, and in hurried glances at Robert Callahan. It was no longer just about one manager's mistake. It had become a reckoning. The first signs of transformation were subtle. Posters announcing the Equity and Inclusion Initiative were placed in high-traffic areas of the bank. Words like unconscious bias and cultural awareness were now part of the daily vernacular. For some, it was overdue. For others, it was uncomfortable. Robert Callahan felt it most of all. The man who had once walked the floors of his branch with unshakable confidence now moved through the building like a ghost. Employees barely acknowledged him, their respect eroded by the shame he had brought upon the bank. He'd become an example, spoken of quietly, pointed at when no one was looking. For the first time in years, Robert knew what it felt like to be small. The lessons begin. A week after Victoria's visit, the mandatory cultural awareness and equity training began. Staff were divided into smaller groups, each required to attend 3-day workshops led by a specialized consultant. For many, the training felt like uncharted territory. There were uncomfortable conversations, realizations that stung, and moments where silence spoke louder than words. Eliza sat near the front of her group, her notebook open and pen poised, eager to absorb the material. She wasn't just listening. She was learning, and she saw the opportunity to grow. On the second day of training, the facilitator, Dr. Miriam Chen, paused the session for a discussion. "Let's talk about assumptions," Dr. Chen said, her voice clear but kind. "Bias often comes from the stories we tell ourselves before we know the truth. I want everyone to share a time when they misjudged someone based on assumptions." The room grew still, eyes darting nervously. Eliza glanced around, feeling the hesitation hanging in the air. After a long pause, a hand rose from the back of the room. It was Robert Callahan. Heads turned, whispers silenced. Robert, who had sat stiff and silent through the first day of training, now looked as though he'd made up his mind. When Dr. Chen nodded for him to speak, he cleared his throat, his voice quieter than anyone expected. "Last week, I made a mistake," he began, his gaze fixed on his hands. "A client, as shareholder of this bank, came in to deposit a check, and I doubted her. I didn't look at her documentation. I didn't consider her history with this institution. I didn't see her. Instead, I saw what I wanted to see, someone who didn't fit my idea of success." The room was silent. "It wasn't the system," Robert continued. "It was me. I was the problem. I let my assumptions guide my judgment, and I disrespected someone who deserved better." His voice caught slightly, but he pushed forward. "I wish I could undo it, but I can't. What I can do is face it and learn from it." Eliza stared at him, her initial surprise giving way to something else, curiosity. Was Robert Callahan truly changing, or was this performance for the sake of saving face? She couldn't be sure yet, but there was something different about the man who now sat, shoulders slightly slumped, no longer exuding the untouchable arrogance she once knew. Dr. Chen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Callahan. Owning our mistakes is one of the hardest steps in personal growth. Remember, accountability is not a punishment. It's an opportunity to do better." Victoria returns. The following week, Victoria Brooks returned to the downtown branch, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her presence was no longer a storm, but a calm breeze that reminded everyone who she was and what she represented: change. She was greeted more warmly this time. The same staff who had whispered behind her back now stood straighter, their tones more respectful. It wasn't fear that drove their actions now, it was understanding. Victoria carried herself with the same quiet power as before, though today there was something different in her demeanor: pride. Jean Ellis met her in the lobby, a relieved smile on her face. "Victoria, it's good to see you." Victoria shook her hand firmly. "Good to see you too, Jen. How are things progressing?" Jean gestured toward the staff. "The training has been well received overall. There's still work to do, but the foundation is shifting." Victoria's gaze wandered across the lobby. The tension she had felt during her first visit had lessened, though she knew such changes took time. Her eyes landed on Eliza, who stood at her station, looking more confident than before. "Who's the young woman?" Victoria asked. Eliza Vargas, Jean replied. She's one of our junior cashiers. Smart, driven. She spoke up during your last visit. Victoria smiled softly. She did. I'll remember that. The conversation that changed everything. Robert Callahan stood in his office, reviewing files when there was a knock at the door. He looked up to find Victoria Brooks standing there, her expression calm but unreadable. "Ms. Brooks," he said, startled. "Please, come in." Victoria entered and gestured to the chair across from him. "May I sit?" "Of course." Robert sank back into his chair, hands nervously folded on the desk. Victoria studied him for a moment. "How have you been, Mr. Callahan?" Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Humbled." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Humbled." Robert exhaled slowly. "The last few weeks have forced me to take a hard look at myself. I've spent years telling myself I knew this business, this industry, better than anyone else. But I missed something fundamental. People." Victoria nodded, though she offered no response. "I want to say I'm sorry again," Robert continued. "Not just for what I did to you, but for what I've been blind to for so long. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Victoria studied him closely. She had dealt with men like Robert her entire life, men who couldn't see past their assumptions. But something in Robert's voice told her he wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. He was genuinely trying. "Robert," she said finally, "everyone makes mistakes. But accountability means asking yourself what comes next. Are you willing to make real changes, or are these just words?" He looked her straight in the eye. "I'm willing." Victoria allowed a small smile to form. "Good. Then prove it." She stood, gathering her coat. As she moved to leave, she turned back. "One more thing. If you want to change how others see the world, start with yourself. Lead by example." Robert nodded, her words sinking in like stones in water. A future rebuilt. Over the coming months, Grant National Bank transformed. Cultural training became a standard part of onboarding. Complaint procedures were streamlined, and diversity initiatives were introduced at every level. Staff meetings no longer echoed with unspoken biases, but with open, honest dialogue. Eliza received a promotion to senior teller, recognized for her courage and integrity. Victoria Brooks became an even more present figure, visiting the bank regularly to oversee its progress and ensure that accountability remained the cornerstone of its success. As for Robert Callahan, he was no longer the same man. The arrogant manager who once ruled with unquestioned authority was gone, replaced by someone humbler and more self-aware. He learned to listen, not just to his staff, but to his own shortcomings. One day, months later, Victoria returned to the bank. As she walked through the polished marble lobby, she noticed the difference, not just in the atmosphere, but in the people. Robert Callahan, now standing near the front desk, offered her a nod of respect. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone sincere. Victoria smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan." It wasn't just the bank that had changed. It was the people within it. And for Victoria, that was always the real victory. Rewriting the rules. The transformation at Grant National Bank was far from complete, but the gears were turning. Change, Victoria Brooks often said, is not a moment, it's a movement. And while some saw her initial confrontation with Robert Callahan as a singular event, Victoria knew it was the spark that had lit a larger fire, one she intended to keep burning. That morning, Victoria sat at the head of the large mahogany conference table in the sleek headquarters of Brooks Enterprises. Around her sat a team of executives, bankers, and consultants tasked with reshaping the culture of the bank. The walls were adorned with minimalist decor, while sunlight poured through wide windows, casting long, clean lines across the space. "I want the report," she said simply, setting down her espresso cup. Her words, though calm, carried the weight of expectation. Angela, her assistant, handed out copies of a thick binder labeled Equity and Progress Review, Phase 1. We've seen notable improvement at the downtown branch over the last 90 days, Angela began. Client complaints have dropped by 40%, and staff satisfaction surveys show a 25% increase in positive feedback regarding management transparency. Additionally, the mandatory cultural awareness training has been completed by 96% of the staff. Victoria nodded, scanning the pages in front of her. That's progress. What about leadership behavior? Angela hesitated briefly before continuing. The staff has noticed a shift in Robert Callahan's management style. He's become more approachable and less defensive. Several employees noted that he actively listens during team meetings and has taken accountability for his past mistakes. A soft murmur rippled through the room as executives exchanged glances. For a leader like Victoria, data wasn't just numbers. It was the story of people. Good, Victoria said, but we're far from done. Systems need to change, not just people. This isn't just about one branch. It's about the entire organization. One of the consultants, a tall man in glasses named James Patel, raised his hand. Ms. Brooks, we've begun drafting a proposal for long-term systemic reform. This includes embedding unconscious bias training into annual employee reviews, diversifying hiring panels, and establishing the Diversity and Accountability Council. Victoria leaned forward, her fingers steepled. And accountability for leadership. What mechanisms will ensure that managers follow through on these reforms? James adjusted his glasses nervously. We'll include quarterly evaluations of leadership performance based on equity measures. Any failure to meet standards will result in consequences, potential loss of bonuses, or, in extreme cases, removal. Victoria's lips curled into the faintest smile. Now we're talking. Robert Callahan's transformation. Back at the downtown branch, Robert Callahan had taken to arriving earlier than usual, long before the first clients entered. These quiet hours were a time for reflection, when the hum of the bank was reduced to silence and the glow of his office lamp illuminated only his desk. Robert had changed, not just in how he managed the bank, but in how he viewed himself. He often revisited the painful memory of Victoria Brooks sitting in his office, her calm power juxtaposed against his misplaced suspicion. The incident had cracked something inside him, and instead of retreating into defensiveness, he'd chosen to face the uncomfortable truth. He had failed, and if he was ever to rebuild his reputation, he had to do better. Robert began walking the bank floor daily, connecting with employees in ways he never had before. He spoke less and listened more. He asked questions, real questions, about their challenges, their ambitions, their thoughts on the new reforms. One morning, as he stood near Eliza Vargas' counter, he watched her deftly assist an elderly couple with their account. Her tone was kind, her patience endless. When the transaction was complete, she noticed Robert observing and smiled nervously. "Good work, Eliza," he said genuinely. "You're a real asset to this branch." Eliza blinked, surprised. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I appreciate what you did that day, for speaking up when I wasn't listening. It took courage." Eliza flushed, but she held her ground. "Someone had to say it, sir." Robert nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "We need more people like you here. Don't be afraid to keep using your voice." The exchange lasted only a few moments, but it lingered with Eliza for the rest of the day. The man who had once been the embodiment of authority and aloofness was learning something she hadn't thought possible: humility. The quarterly audit. By the end of the quarter, the downtown branch was selected for a full equity and performance audit, a process initiated under Victoria Brooks' new policies. Auditors arrived quietly one morning, moving through the branch with checklists and laptops, meeting with employees one by one. For many staff members, the process was nerve-wracking. Transparency was still a new concept, and some feared that their words might be used against them. But Victoria's name carried weight, and her message had been clear: change requires honesty. When it was Robert's turn to meet with the auditors, he entered the conference room with a sense of quiet resolve. The lead auditor, A woman named Diane Harrington offered a polite smile. "Mr. Callahan, thank you for meeting with us." "Of course," Robert replied, taking the seat. "I'm here to cooperate fully." Diane flipped open her laptop. "How would you describe the changes implemented at your branch over the last few months?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Necessary," he said finally. "At first, I didn't want to see it. I thought I knew better. But I've realized that leadership is about growth, not perfection. You can't lead if you're unwilling to learn." Diane looked up, impressed by his candor. "And how has this process changed you personally?" Robert sighed softly. "I've learned to listen, to question my assumptions. I've had to face things about myself that I didn't like, but avoiding the truth wasn't an option anymore." Diane typed a few notes before meeting his gaze. "Accountability is difficult. Most people resist it. Why didn't you?" Robert smiled faintly, the lines of his face softer than before. "Because Victoria Brooks showed me what real leadership looks like, and for the first time in a long time, I had no excuse not to follow her example." Victoria's surprise visit. 2 days after the audit, Victoria Brooks returned to the downtown branch unannounced. The staff no longer gawked or whispered. They greeted her warmly, with smiles and nods of recognition. There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Victoria walked the floor slowly, stopping to chat with tellers, managers, and clients. When she reached Eliza's counter, she paused. "Eliza," Victoria said warmly. "How have you been?" Eliza's eyes lit up. "Very well, Ms. Brooks. Thank you." Victoria leaned slightly closer. "And have you thought about my offer?" Eliza hesitated, her fingers tapping the desk nervously. "I have, ma'am. I want to grow. I want to be a part of something bigger. But I love this branch. It's my home." Victoria smiled, her expression softening. "Then stay and make it better, Eliza. Change happens because people like you push for it." Eliza beamed. "I'll do my best." Victoria turned and walked toward Robert's office. This time, when she entered, Robert stood respectfully, a hint of nervousness still lingering. "Ms. Brooks," he greeted, extending a hand. Victoria shook it, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course," he said quickly. Victoria studied him, noticing the difference in his demeanor. Less polished, more grounded. "How are things, Robert?" He met her gaze directly. "Improving. Slowly, but surely." Victoria nodded, satisfied. "Good. I hope you understand this wasn't about punishing you." "I do now," Robert replied. "It was about progress." Victoria smiled, standing. "Exactly. Let's make sure it continues." As she walked out of his office, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A culture rewritten. In the months that followed, the downtown branch became a model of success, often cited as the gold standard for how organizations can transform under visionary leadership. Staff turnover decreased, client trust improved, and relationships flourished under a newfound culture of equity and respect. Victoria Brooks had set out to challenge the status quo, and she had succeeded. But she knew this was just the beginning. There were other branches, other businesses, and other minds still untouched by change. And Victoria was ready for all of them. A legacy carved in stone. Months had passed since Victoria Brooks' visit to the downtown branch of Grant National Bank, but its effects had reverberated far beyond those marble walls. The transformation, once met with resistance and discomfort, had become a movement, one that stretched across the entire organization. What had begun as a confrontation with a single manager had evolved into something larger, something timeless, the rewriting of an institution's DNA. Victoria sat in her office, surrounded by the quiet hum of success. Her desk, free of clutter, reflected her disciplined approach to leadership. On the corner lay the latest progress report, Equity and Accountability Initiative, Phase 2. Angela entered the room with her usual efficiency, a smile brightening her face. Ms. Brooks, you're on the front page again. Victoria looked up, raising a brow. Which one this time? Angela placed the folded newspaper on her desk, the headline emblazoned in bold letters. Banking giant rebuilt. How Victoria Brooks challenged tradition and won. Victoria allowed herself a small smile as she scanned the article, noting phrases like visionary leadership, systemic reform, and a turning point in corporate culture. Yet, beyond the accolades and glowing words, her thoughts were already focused on the next steps. Any updates on the Leadership Mentorship Program? Victoria asked, setting the paper aside. Angela nodded. We finalized the selection for the first group of mentees. 20 employees from various branches, all nominated for their leadership potential. Eliza Vargas is among them. Victoria's smile deepened. Good. I want to meet with the group personally before they begin. Leadership isn't just about policies. It's about people. Angela handed over a schedule. You'll meet with them next week at the new Leadership Training Center. The center is finished. Victoria asked, her curiosity piqued. Yes, Angela replied, her voice carrying pride. They've named it the Brooks Center for Leadership and Equity. Victoria looked up, stunned for a moment. Who approved that? The board, Angela said. They wanted to honor your contributions. Victoria leaned back in her chair, silent for a moment as the weight of the acknowledgement settled over her. It wasn't about vanity. It was about legacy. To have her name tied to something that would outlive her, to build an institution where people like her didn't have to fight for respect. That mattered. The Brooks Center for Leadership and Equity. A week later, Victoria arrived at the newly completed Brooks Center for its grand opening. The building, sleek and modern with glass facades and warm wood tones, was a physical representation of progress. The gold lettering of her name etched above the entrance felt surreal. Inside, the space buzzed with excitement as employees, executives, and journalists filled the atrium. At the center of it all stood Eliza Vargas, surrounded by a group of young professionals, all eager, all ready for something new. She looked polished and confident in her navy blazer, a far cry from the timid young cashier who had once second-guessed speaking up. When Eliza spotted Victoria, her face lit up. She excused herself from the group and walked over, her steps purposeful. Ms. Brooks, Eliza said warmly, extending her hand. Welcome. Victoria shook her hand firmly. Eliza, you look ready. I am, Eliza said, her voice full of confidence. Thank you for this opportunity. I wouldn't be here if you hadn't seen something in me. Victoria smiled. You earned your place, Eliza. I just helped clear the path. Eliza's gaze grew thoughtful. That's what I want to do here, to help other people grow. People like me, who never imagined themselves in leadership positions. Victoria studied her for a moment, pride swelling in her chest. You're already leading, Eliza. Keep pushing forward, and others will follow. Robert's full circle moment. The ceremony began shortly afterward, with speeches from senior executives and partners praising the bank's transformation and the new center's role in fostering future leaders. Victoria listened attentively, though she rarely enjoyed being the focus of such events. She preferred action to applause. Near the end of the event, Robert Callahan approached her tentatively. He looked healthier, lighter, like a man who had shed a burden that had weighed on him for far too long. Ms. Brooks, he greeted, his voice steady but respectful. May I have a moment? Of course, Robert, Victoria replied, turning to face him. Robert exhaled, hands clasped in front of him. I wanted to thank you. For what? Victoria asked, genuinely curious. For not giving up on me, he said. You could have had me fired. Most people would have. Instead, you gave me a chance to see myself for what I was. And to change. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him. And did you? Robert nodded, his gaze unwavering. I did. I know I'll never be perfect, but I'm better now. I see people differently. I listen. I've learned that leadership isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Victoria gave him a small nod of approval. Good. Growth is uncomfortable, Robert, but it's necessary. You've proven that change is possible, if you're willing to do the work. Robert smiled faintly, a man no longer defined by his mistakes, but by what he did to correct them. Thank you for teaching me that. Don't thank me, Victoria said softly. Thank yourself. You chose to be better. With that, Robert extended his hand. Victoria shook it firmly, a moment of mutual respect passing between them. Two people who had started as adversaries, but found themselves on the same side of change. A future beyond the horizon. That evening, Victoria returned to her office, the hum of the city echoing beyond her window. She stood in the quiet, looking out over the skyline that had once felt like an obstacle, a towering reminder of doors that had always been closed to her. Now those doors were open, not just for her, but for countless others who would come after her. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from Angela. The leadership mentees have officially begun their training. Eliza's leading the charge. You'd be proud. Victoria smiled, a soft warmth spreading through her chest. She set the phone down, looking back out at the city lights. This was the legacy she'd worked for, not a plaque on a wall or a newspaper headline, but people like Eliza stepping forward. People who were unafraid to speak up, to lead, to challenge a system that had once been rigged against them. The story wasn't finished. Change wasn't a destination, but a journey. And Victoria Brooks would keep walking that path, breaking barriers and rewriting rules for as long as it took. Because for her, success was never about what she achieved. It was about what she left behind.